The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of what was once downtown Chicago, its golden rays illuminating the skeletal remains of skyscrapers that had once housed millions of dreams. Zephyr Blackwood pressed her back against the cold concrete wall of a collapsed overpass, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air as she listened for the telltale shuffle of the infected. 3 years had passed since the Crimson Plague swept across the continent like wildfire, transforming the living into mindless predators with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Now, in what survivors grimly called the final days, the last pockets of humanity clung to existence in a world that no longer belonged to them. From her vantage point, Zephyr could see the smoke rising from the settlement of Haven's Rest, a fortified community built within the ruins of Millennium Park. It was one of the last bastions of civilization in the Midwest, home to nearly 800 souls who had somehow managed to survive the apocalypse. Among them was her younger brother, Orion, who had been born just months before the outbreak began. He had never known a world without the constant threat of death lurking around every corner, never experienced the simple joy of walking down a street without fear. The thought of him growing up in this nightmare fueled Zephyr's determination to find a way to end the war between the living and the dead. As she made her way through the debris-strewn streets, Zephyr's mind wandered to the radio transmission they had received 3 days ago. A voice claiming to represent the Continental Defense Coalition had broadcast on all emergency frequencies, announcing the discovery of a potential cure for the Crimson Plague. The transmission had been brief and filled with static, but the message was clear. Survivors were to gather at coordinates in the Rocky Mountains, where a final stand would be made against the infected hordes. The broadcast had sparked fierce debate among the leadership of Haven's Rest, with some viewing it as humanity's last hope and others dismissing it as a cruel hoax designed to lure survivors into a trap. The sound of approaching footsteps caused Zephyr to freeze, her hand instinctively moving to the modified crossbow strapped to her back. Through the morning mist, she could make out the familiar silhouette of Thaddeus Grimm, the settlement's chief scout and her closest friend since the early days of the outbreak. His weathered face bore the scars of countless encounters with the infected, and his steel-gray eyes held the weight of too many losses. Despite his gruff exterior, Thaddeus had become something of a father figure to Zephyr, teaching her the skills necessary to survive in this hostile world. "The council's reached a decision," Thaddeus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're sending an expedition to investigate the transmission. 50 volunteers including you and me." He paused, studying her reaction carefully. "Evangeline's leading the mission personally." The mention of Evangeline Ashworth, Haven's Rest's elected leader and a former military strategist, sent a chill down Zephyr's spine. If Evangeline was willing to leave the safety of the settlement, the situation must be more desperate than anyone had admitted publicly. As they made their way back toward Haven's Rest, Zephyr couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The infected had grown more cunning over the years, developing pack-like behaviors and showing signs of rudimentary intelligence that defied everything scientists had initially believed about the plague. Some survivors whispered about evolved variants that could think and plan, creatures that retained fragments of their human memories while possessing all the predatory instincts of the infected. These rumors were usually dismissed as hysteria born from prolonged stress, but Zephyr had seen things during her scouting missions that made her wonder if there might be truth to the stories. The settlement's walls came into view as they crested a small hill, the reinforced barriers standing 20 feet high and topped with razor wire that glinted menacingly in the sunlight. Guard towers positioned at regular intervals housed sentries armed with high-powered rifles, their vigilant eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of danger. Despite the fortress-like appearance, Zephyr knew that Haven's Rest was slowly dying. Food supplies were dwindling, ammunition was running low, and the psychological toll of constant vigilance was wearing down even the strongest survivors. Children born after the outbreak showed signs of developmental delays, their young minds struggling to cope with the perpetual state of fear that had become their normal existence. Inside the settlement, life continued with the mechanical precision of a community that had learned to function despite overwhelming adversity. Gardens tended by skilled agriculturalists provided fresh vegetables, while workshops hummed with the activity of craftsmen who had learned to create weapons and tools from salvaged materials. The medical bay, overseen by Dr. Lysander Cross, a former neurosurgeon who had lost his family in the first wave of infections, worked tirelessly to treat injuries and illnesses with increasingly limited supplies. Every aspect of daily life was governed by strict protocols designed to maximize survival, yet beneath the surface, Zephyr could sense the growing desperation that threatened to tear the community apart. As evening approached and the expedition prepared for departure, Zephyr found herself standing at the edge of the settlement cemetery, where simple wooden crosses marked the graves of those who had fallen defending their home. The weight of responsibility pressed down upon her shoulders like a physical burden, and she wondered if the journey ahead would lead to salvation or simply add more names to the growing list of the dead. The expedition departed Haven's Rest under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, 50 volunteers moving like ghosts through the abandoned suburbs that surrounded their former home. Evangeline Ashworth led the column with the confidence of someone who had commanded troops in conventional warfare, though the enemy they now faced bore little resemblance to any human adversary she had encountered during her military career. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her green eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for signs of danger. Despite being in her early 40s, Evangeline moved with the fluid grace of someone half her age, her body hardened by years of survival in the post-apocalyptic wasteland. Beside her walked Cassius Nightingale, a former CDC researcher whose expertise in infectious diseases had made him invaluable to the settlement's survival efforts. His pale complexion and nervous mannerisms stood in stark contrast to the hardened warriors surrounding him, but his knowledge of the Crimson Plague had saved countless lives over the years. Cassius carried with him a modified tablet computer containing every piece of data they had managed to collect about the infection, including disturbing reports of mutations and behavioral changes that suggested the plague was continuing to evolve in ways that defied conventional understanding. The group moved in practiced silence through the skeletal remains of suburban neighborhoods, their footsteps muffled by years of accumulated debris and overgrown vegetation. Nature had begun to reclaim the abandoned communities with startling speed, vines crawling up the sides of houses while trees pushed through cracked foundations. Wildlife had returned to areas that had been devoid of animal life for decades, though even the animals seemed different now, more aggressive and unpredictable than their pre-plague counterparts. Some survivors theorized that the Crimson Plague had affected more than just humans, creating subtle changes in the ecosystem that would have far-reaching consequences for any future attempts at rebuilding civilization. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the expedition encountered their first signs of infected activity. Thaddeus raised his hand in a silent signal, causing the entire column to freeze in place as he pointed toward a cluster of abandoned vehicles on the highway ahead. Through the rusted hulks of cars and trucks, they could see movement, the shambling gait of infected individuals who had once been ordinary people living ordinary lives. The sight never failed to affect Zephyr deeply, reminding her that each of these creatures had once possessed hopes, dreams, and loved ones who mourned their transformation. Evangeline made quick hand signals, directing the group to circle around the infected cluster rather than engage them directly. Combat was to be avoided whenever possible, not out of mercy for the creatures they had become, but because noise and commotion would inevitably attract more of their kind. The infected possessed an uncanny ability to communicate with each other through low-frequency vocalizations that could travel for miles, summoning reinforcements from vast distances. A single gunshot could bring hundreds of them converging on a location within hours, turning a minor encounter into a desperate fight for survival. The detour added several hours to their journey, forcing them to navigate through a dense forest that had grown wild in the absence of human maintenance. The canopy above filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns that danced across the forest floor, creating an almost peaceful atmosphere that belied the constant danger surrounding them. It was in places like this that Zephyr sometimes allowed herself to imagine what the world might have been like if the plague had never happened, if her brother could have grown up climbing trees and exploring nature without fear of being torn apart by mindless predators. Dr. Lysander Cross brought up the rear of the column, his medical bag slung across his shoulder and his eyes constantly alert for signs of injury or illness among the expedition members. The stress of the journey was already beginning to show on some of the volunteers, particularly those who had rarely ventured beyond the safety of Haven's Rest. Lysander had seen too many good people break under the psychological pressure of life in the wasteland, their minds simply unable to cope with the constant threat of violent death. He carried with him a small supply of sedatives and antidepressants, medications that were worth their weight in gold in a world where mental health resources had become virtually non-existent. As evening approached, the expedition made camp in the ruins of a small town that had been thoroughly picked clean by previous scavenging parties. The buildings stood empty and hollow, their windows staring out like dead eyes at the world that had moved on without them. Evangeline posted sentries at strategic locations while the rest of the group settled in for what would likely be a sleepless night. The infected were more active after dark, their enhanced senses allowing them to hunt more effectively in low-light conditions. Sleep would come in shifts, with half the group remaining alert while the others attempted to rest. Zephyr found herself assigned to the first watch alongside a young woman named Seraphina Vale, a former teacher who had joined the expedition despite having no combat experience. Serafina's optimism and determination reminded Zephyr of herself in the early days after the outbreak, before the harsh realities of survival had worn away her naive belief that things would eventually return to normal. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the shadows lengthen across the abandoned town, Zephyr wondered how many more communities like this one lay scattered across the continent, silent monuments to a civilization that had vanished almost overnight. The night passed without incident, though none of them truly slept. Tomorrow would bring them closer to the coordinates mentioned in the mysterious radio transmission, and with each mile traveled, the weight of uncertainty grew heavier upon their shoulders. The third day of their journey brought the expedition to the outskirts of what had once been Denver, Colorado, a sprawling metropolis that now served as a haunting reminder of humanity's former glory. The city's skyline was broken and jagged, with several skyscrapers having collapsed entirely while others stood at precarious angles, their structural integrity compromised by years of neglect and the occasional seismic activity that had become more common since the outbreak. Evangeline called a halt at the crest of a hill overlooking the urban wasteland, using military-grade binoculars to survey the scene below while the rest of the expedition took advantage of the brief respite to rest and hydrate. What they saw defied their worst expectations. The streets of Denver were not empty as they had hoped, but instead teemed with infected in numbers that boggled the mind. Thousands upon thousands of the creatures moved through the city in what appeared to be organized patterns, their movements suggesting a level of coordination that sent chills down the spines of even the most hardened survivors. Cassius Nightingale studied the scene through his own binoculars, his scientific mind racing to process the implications of what they were witnessing. The infected were not wandering aimlessly as they had in the early days of the plague, but instead seemed to be following specific routes and gathering in predetermined locations. "They're hurting," Thaddeus whispered, his voice barely audible even to those standing directly beside him. "Look at the way they're moving. It's like they're being directed by something." His observation sent a wave of unease through the group, as the implications of organized infected behavior were too terrifying to fully contemplate. If the creatures had developed the ability to coordinate their actions on such a massive scale, it would fundamentally change the nature of the war between the living and the dead. Dr. Lysander Cross joined the observation team, his medical training allowing him to notice details that others might miss. "Their physical condition appears to be deteriorating," he noted quietly. "Many of them show signs of advanced decomposition, yet they continue to function. The plague must be adapting to maintain motor function even as the host body breaks down." His clinical assessment provided little comfort to the expedition members, who were already struggling to process the sheer scale of the infected population below. Serafina Vale stood slightly apart from the others, her face pale with shock as she witnessed the true extent of the catastrophe that had befallen their world. As a teacher, she had always believed in the power of education and human progress to overcome any obstacle, but the sight before her challenged every optimistic assumption she had ever held about the future of their species. The infected masses below represented not just the death of individuals, but the complete collapse of everything that had made human civilization possible. Evangeline lowered her binoculars and turned to address the group, her expression grim but determined. "We'll have to go around," she announced. "The coordinates we're heading for are on the other side of the city, but there's no way we can make it through that concentration of infected. We'll add at least 2 days to our journey, but it's better than walking into certain death." Her decision was met with nods of agreement from the expedition members, though everyone understood that the detour would strain their already limited supplies and increase their exposure to other dangers. As they prepared to leave their observation point, a new sound reached their ears, a low rhythmic pounding that seemed to emanate from the heart of the city. The noise was unlike anything they had heard before, a deep thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Cassius immediately began taking notes on his tablet, documenting this new behavior for future analysis. "It's almost like a drumbeat," he murmured. "But what could be causing it and why?" The question hung in the air unanswered, adding another layer of mystery to an already incomprehensible situation. The expedition began their circuitous route around the infected city, traveling through mountainous terrain that tested their endurance and navigation skills. The Rocky Mountains had always been beautiful, but in the post-apocalyptic world, they had taken on an almost supernatural quality. The absence of human activity had allowed wildlife to flourish in ways not seen for generations, though even the animals seemed different now, more wary and aggressive than their pre-plague ancestors. Mountain lions and bears had become significant threats to travelers, their natural fear of humans apparently diminished by years of scavenging on infected corpses. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thin and cold, forcing the expedition members to don additional layers of clothing salvaged from abandoned outdoor gear stores. The physical exertion of mountain travel was taking its toll on some of the volunteers, particularly those who had spent most of their time within the relative safety of Haven's Rest. Dr. Lysander found himself treating cases of altitude sickness and exhaustion with increasing frequency, his medical supplies dwindling faster than anticipated. Zephyr found herself thinking about her brother Orion as she navigated the treacherous mountain paths. He would be celebrating his 3rd birthday soon, though celebrations in Haven's Rest were subdued affairs marked more by gratitude for survival than joy. She wondered if he would ever have the chance to see mountains like these under peaceful circumstances, to experience the simple pleasure of hiking without constantly watching for threats. The thought of him growing up in a world where such experiences were impossible filled her with a determination that burned brighter than any physical discomfort she might feel. On the evening of their 5th day, as they made camp in a sheltered valley between 2 peaks, Thaddeus approached Evangeline with troubling news. His scouting had revealed signs of recent human activity in the area, footprints, discarded equipment, and the remains of campfires that were no more than a few days old. The discovery raised immediate questions about who else might be traveling through these remote mountains and whether their intentions were friendly or hostile. In a world where resources were scarce and trust was a luxury few could afford, encountering other survivors could be as dangerous as facing the infected themselves. The discovery of other human presence in the mountains forced Evangeline to make a difficult decision about the expedition's security protocols. She ordered the group to maintain complete radio silence and to travel only during daylight hours, when their visibility would be maximized and the chances of walking into an ambush would be reduced. The mysterious footprints Thaddeus had found showed signs of military-style boots and organized movement patterns, suggesting that whoever had passed through the area possessed both training and equipment that could make them formidable adversaries if their intentions proved hostile. Cassius Nightingale spent the evening analyzing soil samples and other trace evidence left behind by the unknown travelers, his scientific background allowing him to extract information that others might miss. At least 12 individuals, he reported to Evangeline during their evening briefing. Well-equipped and moving with purpose toward the same general coordinates we're heading for. They passed through here approximately 72 hours ago. His analysis confirmed what everyone had already suspected. They were not the only ones responding to the mysterious radio transmission about a potential cure for the Crimson Plague. The 6th day of their journey brought them to a high mountain pass where the air was so thin that even simple tasks became exhausting. Several expedition members were showing signs of severe altitude sickness, forcing Dr. Lysander to make the difficult decision to administer some of their precious medical supplies to keep the group moving. The landscape around them was both breathtaking and terrifying, with sheer cliffs dropping away into misty valleys below and snow-capped peaks stretching endlessly in all directions. It was a reminder of how small and vulnerable humanity had become in the face of forces beyond their control. As they descended from the pass, Seraphina Vale stumbled and nearly fell from the narrow trail, saved only by Zephyr's quick reflexes in grabbing her arm. The near miss served as a stark reminder of how precarious their situation had become, with exhaustion and stress taking an increasing toll on the expedition members. Seraphina's hands were shaking as she thanked Zephyr for the rescue, her earlier optimism beginning to crack under the weight of their circumstances. "I keep thinking about my students," she whispered. "The ones who didn't make it to the settlement in time. They were so young, so full of life. What kind of world are we trying to save?" The question haunted Zephyr as they continued their descent toward the coordinates specified in the radio transmission. She had been so focused on the possibility of finding a cure that she had not fully considered what would come after. Even if they succeeded in eliminating the Crimson Plague, the world that remained would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed before the outbreak. Entire generations had been lost, infrastructure had crumbled, and the survivors bore psychological scars that might never fully heal. The task of rebuilding civilization would be monumental, requiring resources and cooperation that seemed almost impossible to achieve. On the 7th day, they encountered their first evidence of the Continental Defense Coalition mentioned in the radio transmission. A series of metal markers had been placed along the mountain trails, each bearing the CDC logo and directional arrows pointing toward their destination. The markers were clearly recent additions to the landscape, their surfaces still shiny and unmarked by weather. More importantly, they showed signs of having been installed by people with access to manufacturing capabilities and organized logistics, resources that most survivor communities could only dream of possessing. Thaddeus examined the markers carefully, his experienced eye noting details that others might overlook. Professional work, he concluded. These weren't made in some makeshift workshop. Whoever placed them has access to industrial equipment and raw materials. His assessment raised new questions about the true nature of the Continental Defense Coalition and how they had managed to maintain such capabilities in a world where most communities struggled to produce basic necessities. As they followed the marked trail deeper into the mountains, the expedition began to encounter other signs of organized activity. Solar panels had been installed on south-facing slopes, their cables disappearing into camouflaged bunkers built into the mountainside. Communication antennas sprouted from carefully concealed positions, and the occasional glimpse of movement in the distance suggested that they were now under observation by unseen watchers. The level of infrastructure they were witnessing far exceeded anything that existed at Haven's Rest, implying that the Continental Defense Coalition possessed resources and manpower that dwarfed their own community. Dr. Lysander found himself both hopeful and apprehensive about what they might find at their destination. As a medical professional, he understood better than most the challenges involved in developing a cure for the Crimson Plague. The virus had proven remarkably adaptable, mutating in response to environmental pressures and showing resistance to every treatment that had been attempted in the early days of the outbreak. If the coalition truly had made a breakthrough, it would represent one of the greatest scientific achievements in human history. However, his experience with the plague had also taught him to be skeptical of claims that seemed too good to be true. The 8th day brought them within sight of their destination, a massive complex built into the side of a mountain and camouflaged so effectively that it was nearly invisible until they were almost upon it. The facility appeared to be a combination of natural caves and artificial construction, with multiple levels extending deep into the mountainside. Guard towers positioned at strategic points around the perimeter were manned by sentries in military-style uniforms, their weapons and equipment clearly superior to anything the expedition had seen since the outbreak began. As they approached the main entrance, Evangeline called for the expedition to halt while she considered their options. The facility before them represented either humanity's last hope for survival or a trap that could doom them all. The guards had undoubtedly spotted their approach, but no hostile actions had been taken, suggesting that their arrival was expected. Still, the sight of so much military hardware and organized infrastructure was both reassuring and intimidating, raising questions about what kind of organization the Continental Defense Coalition truly was and what price they might demand for their assistance. Zephyr felt her heart racing as she stared at the imposing structure before them. Somewhere within those walls might lie the key to ending the nightmare that had consumed their world, the chance to give her brother Orion and countless other children a future free from the constant threat of the infected. But she also sensed that whatever lay ahead would test them in ways they had not yet imagined, challenging not just their physical survival but their fundamental beliefs about what it meant to be human in a world that had forgotten how to hope. The guards who emerged from the facility to greet them were unlike any survivors the expedition had encountered during their journey. Their uniforms were clean and well-maintained, their equipment modern and functional, and their bearing suggested military discipline that had somehow survived the collapse of conventional authority. The leader of the guard detail introduced himself as Commander Atticus Ravencroft, a tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the approaching expedition with calculating precision. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, yet there was also a weariness in his expression that spoke of too many difficult decisions made in impossible circumstances. "Welcome to Sanctuary Base," Commander Ravencroft announced as he approached Evangeline. "We've been monitoring your progress for the past 2 days. Your timing is fortuitous. We're preparing for the final phase of Operation Lazarus, and we can use every capable volunteer we can find." His words carried implications that sent a chill through the expedition members, suggesting that their arrival was not merely coincidental but part of some larger plan that had been set in motion long before they received the radio transmission. Evangeline stepped forward to address the commander, her military bearing evident as she introduced herself and explained their mission. "We represent the Haven's Rest settlement, approximately 800 survivors located in the Chicago area. We received your transmission about a potential cure for the Crimson Plague and have come to offer our assistance in whatever way possible." Her formal tone masked the desperation that all of them felt, the knowledge that their community's survival might depend on whatever was happening within the mountain facility. Commander Ravencroft nodded approvingly at Evangeline's directness. "The Continental Defense Coalition has been working for 3 years to develop a solution to the plague crisis," he explained. "We've made significant progress, but the final implementation requires resources and manpower that we cannot provide alone. Your arrival, along with that of several other survivor groups, gives us the numbers we need to attempt what may be humanity's last chance for survival. His words were carefully chosen, revealing just enough information to maintain their interest while withholding details that might cause them to reconsider their involvement. As they were escorted into the facility, the expedition members found themselves overwhelmed by the scale and sophistication of the operation. The corridors were well lit and climate-controlled, with modern equipment humming quietly in the background. Laboratory spaces visible through reinforced windows contained scientific apparatus that most of them had not seen since before the outbreak, tended by researchers in clean white coats who moved with the confidence of people working on the cutting edge of human knowledge. The contrast with their own makeshift existence was so stark that it seemed almost surreal. Dr. Lysander was particularly affected by the sight of the medical facilities, his professional eye immediately recognizing equipment and procedures that he had only dreamed of having access to during his years of treating patients with salvaged supplies and improvised techniques. "How is this possible?" he whispered to Cassius as they passed a fully equipped surgical suite. "Where did they get all of this equipment? How have they maintained power and climate control?" His questions reflected the amazement that all of them felt at discovering such an advanced facility in a world they had believed was completely devastated. Cassius Nightingale was equally impressed by the research laboratories, though his scientific training also made him more skeptical about the claims being made. "The level of infrastructure required to maintain this facility would be enormous," he murmured to Zephyr as they walked. "They would need not just equipment and supplies, but also a large population of skilled technicians and researchers. Where did all these people come from, and how have they remained hidden for so long?" His questions highlighted the mystery surrounding the Continental Defense Coalition and raised concerns about what they might not be revealing about their true nature and capabilities. Thaddeus remained alert and suspicious as they were led deeper into the facility, his survival instincts warning him that something about the situation was not quite right. The guards were too well equipped, the facility too pristine, and the whole operation too organized for a world that had supposedly collapsed 3 years ago. "Keep your eyes open," he whispered to Zephyr during a brief moment when their escorts were distracted. "This place feels more like a military installation that survived the outbreak than a survivor community that built something new." His observation reflected the growing unease that several expedition members were beginning to feel about their hosts. Seraphina Vale found herself torn between hope and apprehension as she witnessed the apparent success of the Continental Defense Coalition. The facility represented everything she had hoped might still exist in the world: organized society, scientific progress, and the possibility of a better future for the children who had survived the plague. Yet something about the sterile perfection of their surroundings felt artificial, as if they were being shown a carefully constructed facade designed to impress rather than inform. "It's almost too good to be true," she confided to Dr. Lysander during their tour. "After everything we've been through, how can such a place still exist?" As evening approached, the expedition was assigned quarters within the facility and invited to attend a briefing about Operation Lazarus. The meeting was held in a large conference room equipped with modern audiovisual equipment, where Commander Ravencroft and his staff presented their plan for ending the Crimson Plague crisis. The scope of their proposal was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its implications, involving coordinated strikes against infected population centers using weapons and tactics that pushed the boundaries of what most survivors would consider acceptable in the fight for humanity's survival. The briefing revealed that the Continental Defense Coalition had been monitoring infected populations across the continent, mapping their movements and identifying key concentration points where large numbers of the creatures had gathered. Their plan involved simultaneous attacks on these locations using a combination of conventional weapons and experimental biological agents designed to accelerate the decomposition process that was already affecting the infected. The goal was to eliminate the majority of the infected population within a matter of weeks, clearing the way for survivor communities to begin the process of reclaiming their world. However, the plan also carried enormous risks, including the possibility of unintended consequences from the biological agents and the potential for massive environmental damage from the scale of destruction required. As the briefing continued, it became clear that Operation Lazarus was not just about finding a cure for the plague, but about making a fundamental decision about what kind of world humanity wanted to rebuild from the ashes of the old one. The revelation of Operation Lazarus's true scope left the expedition members grappling with moral and practical questions that had no easy answers. As they gathered in their assigned quarters after the briefing, heated discussions erupted about the ethics of using biological weapons against the infected, even if those weapons might end the plague crisis. Dr. Lysander found himself at the center of these debates, his medical oath to do no harm, conflicting with the desperate need to find a solution to humanity's survival crisis. These creatures were once human beings, he argued passionately. They had families, dreams, hopes for the future. Are we justified in using weapons that could cause them additional suffering, even if they're no longer truly alive? Cassius Nightingale approached the question from a purely scientific perspective, though his conclusions were no less troubling. The biological agents they're proposing are essentially accelerated decomposition catalysts, he explained to the group. They would cause the infected tissue to break down rapidly, effectively destroying the motor functions that allow the creatures to move and hunt. From a purely practical standpoint, it's an elegant solution to the problem. However, we have no way of knowing what long-term effects these agents might have on the environment or on any humans who might be exposed to them. His analysis highlighted the enormous gamble that Operation Lazarus represented, with potential consequences that could extend far beyond the immediate goal of eliminating the infected. Evangeline found herself torn between her responsibilities as a leader and her growing doubts about the Continental Defense Coalition's methods. The military precision and advanced capabilities of the facility impressed her professional sensibilities, but something about Commander Ravencroft and his staff felt wrong in ways she couldn't quite articulate. "They're asking us to trust them with the future of our species," she confided to Thaddeus during a private conversation. "But they won't tell us where they came from, how they survived the outbreak with such resources intact, or what their long-term plans are for the world after the infected are eliminated." Her concerns reflected the suspicions that were growing among several expedition members about their hosts' true motivations. Thaddeus had been conducting his own informal reconnaissance of the facility, using his skills as a scout to observe details that their hosts might prefer to keep hidden. "The guard rotations are too regular, the equipment too standardized," he reported to Evangeline. "This isn't a survivor community that cobbled together resources after the outbreak. This is a pre-existing military installation that was designed to survive exactly this kind of catastrophe." His observations suggested that the Continental Defense Coalition might have had advanced knowledge of the plague outbreak, raising disturbing questions about their role in the crisis and their true agenda for the future. Zephyr spent much of the evening thinking about her brother Orion and the other children back at Haven's Rest. The possibility of ending the plague crisis and giving them a chance at a normal life was almost too wonderful to contemplate, yet the methods being proposed felt fundamentally wrong in ways that went beyond practical concerns about safety and effectiveness. "What kind of world are we creating for them?" she asked Serafina during one of their conversations. "If we're willing to use weapons like this against the infected, what's to stop us from using them against other survivor communities that we disagree with? Are we saving humanity or just replacing one kind of monster with another?" Serafina had been struggling with similar questions, her background as an educator making her acutely aware of the lessons that would be passed down to future generations. "Children learn more from what we do than from what we say," she observed. "If we teach them that survival justifies any action, no matter how morally questionable, what kind of society will they build when they become adults?" Her concerns highlighted the long-term implications of the choices they were being asked to make, consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate crisis they faced. The next morning brought a new development that forced the expedition to confront the reality of their situation. Commander Ravencroft announced that Operation Lazarus would begin within 48 hours, with or without their participation. Other survivor groups that had responded to the radio transmission had already committed to the plan, providing the coalition with the manpower needed to execute their strategy. The expedition from Haven's Rest could choose to participate and potentially benefit from the operation's success, or they could leave the facility and return to their community to face an uncertain future on their own. Dr. Lysander requested permission to examine the biological agents that would be used in the operation, hoping that his medical expertise might help him assess the risks and benefits more accurately. What he discovered in the coalition's laboratories shook him to his core. The agents were not simply decomposition catalysts as Cassius had been told, but complex biological weapons that had been designed to target specific genetic markers found in infected tissue. More disturbing still, the research data suggested that these weapons had been under development for years before the outbreak began, implying a level of preparation that could only have come from advanced knowledge of the plague's emergence. When Dr. Lysander shared his findings with the rest of the expedition, the implications were staggering. If the Continental Defense Coalition had known about the plague in advance, it raised questions about whether they had played a role in its creation or release. The facility's advanced capabilities and prepositioned resources suddenly took on a more sinister aspect, suggesting that Operation Lazarus might not be humanity's salvation but rather the final phase of a plan that had been set in motion long before the first infected appeared. As the expedition members grappled with these revelations, they realized that they faced a choice that would define not just their own survival but the future of human civilization. They could participate in Operation Lazarus and potentially end the plague crisis, but at the cost of enabling an organization whose true motives remained hidden and whose methods raised profound ethical questions. Alternatively, they could refuse to participate and return to Haven's Rest with the knowledge that they had passed up what might be humanity's last chance for survival. The weight of this decision pressed down upon them like a physical burden, made all the more difficult by the knowledge that time was running out and that whatever choice they made would have consequences that extended far beyond their own lives. The final hours before Operation Lazarus was scheduled to begin passed in a blur of frantic activity and desperate deliberation. The expedition members found themselves isolated from the rest of the facility's personnel, their movements restricted and their communications monitored in ways that made it clear they were no longer guests but potential security risks. Commander Ravencroft's demeanor had shifted from welcoming to coldly professional, his earlier friendliness replaced by the calculating efficiency of someone who viewed them as either assets to be utilized or obstacles to be managed. Evangeline called an emergency meeting in their quarters, speaking in whispers to avoid the surveillance equipment that Thaddeus had identified throughout their living space. "We need to make a decision," she announced grimly. "Based on what Dr. Lysander discovered, I don't think we can trust the Coalition's version of events. But we also can't ignore the possibility that Operation Lazarus might actually work, regardless of their motives." Her words captured the impossible dilemma they faced, choosing between moral principles and practical survival in a world where both seemed equally important and mutually exclusive. Dr. Lysander had spent the night reviewing the research data he had accessed, his medical training allowing him to understand implications that others might miss. "The biological agents they've developed are incredibly sophisticated," he reported to the group. "They're designed to target specific protein structures found only in infected tissue, which means they shouldn't affect healthy humans. However, the speed and thoroughness of the decomposition process they trigger is unlike anything I've seen in nature. If these weapons work as designed, they could eliminate the infected population within weeks, but the environmental impact could be catastrophic." His analysis provided little comfort to expedition members who were already struggling with the ethical implications of the Coalition's plan. Cassius Nightingale had been conducting his own analysis of the facility's research capabilities, using his scientific background to piece together clues about the Coalition's true nature and origins. "The level of preparation required for this operation is staggering," he whispered to the group. "They have detailed maps of infected population centers across the entire continent, real-time monitoring of creature movements, and production facilities capable of manufacturing biological weapons on an industrial scale. This isn't something that could have been assembled after the outbreak began. It represents years of planning and preparation." His conclusions reinforced their growing suspicion that the Continental Defense Coalition was not what it claimed to be. Thaddeus had been using his scouting skills to gather intelligence about the facility's security measures and personnel, information that might prove crucial if they decided to leave or take action against the Coalition's plans. "There are at least 300 personnel in this facility," he reported quietly. "Most of them are military or scientific specialists, not survivors who banded together after the outbreak. The equipment and supplies they have access to would require a massive logistical network to maintain, which means this operation extends far beyond what we can see here." His observations painted a picture of an organization with resources and capabilities that dwarfed anything most survivor communities could imagine. Seraphina Vale found herself thinking about the children back at Haven's Rest, particularly Zephyr's brother Orion and the other young ones who had never known a world without the constant threat of the infected. "What kind of future are we choosing for them?" she asked the group. "If we participate in Operation Lazarus, we might be giving them a world free from the plague, but we'll also be teaching them that survival justifies any action, no matter how morally questionable. If we refuse to participate, we might be condemning them to a lifetime of fear and struggle, but we'll preserve the principles that make us human." Her words highlighted the generational implications of their decision, consequences that would echo through the decades to come. Zephyr had been largely silent during the discussions, her mind focused on the image of her brother's innocent face and the weight of responsibility she felt for his future. "I keep thinking about what Orion will ask me when he's old enough to understand what happened here," she finally said. "Will I be able to tell him that we made the right choice, or will I have to explain why we chose survival over our humanity?" Her question cut to the heart of their dilemma, forcing each expedition member to confront their own values and priorities in the face of an impossible situation. As dawn approached and the final preparations for Operation Lazarus began, the expedition received an unexpected visitor. A young woman named Cordelia Blackthorne, who identified herself as a former coalition researcher, slipped into their quarters under cover of darkness with information that changed everything they thought they knew about the situation. "The plague wasn't an accident," she whispered urgently. "It was a controlled release designed to reduce global population to manageable levels. The coalition represents a shadow government that has been planning this for decades, and Operation Lazarus isn't about saving humanity, it's about establishing complete control over the survivors." Her revelations were so shocking that several expedition members initially refused to believe them, but the evidence she provided was too detailed and specific to dismiss. Cordelia explained that she had been part of the original research team that developed both the Crimson Plague and the biological weapons that would be used to eliminate it. The plan was always to release the plague, allow it to eliminate the majority of the global population, and then use the cure to position themselves as humanity's saviors, she continued. The survivor communities that respond to their call for help will be incorporated into their new world order, while those that refuse will be left to face the remaining infected on their own. Her account painted a picture of manipulation and control that extended far beyond anything the expedition had imagined. The revelation that the plague had been deliberately created and released transformed their moral dilemma into something far more complex and urgent. If Cordelia's information was accurate, then participating in Operation Lazarus would not just involve using questionable weapons against the infected, but would also enable a conspiracy that had deliberately caused the deaths of billions of innocent people. However, refusing to participate might doom not just their own community but all of the remaining survivor settlements to eventual extinction at the hands of the infected hordes. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the mountain peaks surrounding the facility, the expedition members realized that they had run out of time for deliberation. Operation Lazarus would begin within hours, and they needed to decide not just whether to participate, but whether to actively oppose an organization that might represent the greatest threat to human freedom and dignity that had ever existed. The choice they made in the next few hours would determine not just their own fate, but the future of human civilization itself. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable, made all the more difficult by the knowledge that whatever they decided, people would die as a result of their actions or inaction. The decision came suddenly, crystallizing in a moment of shared understanding that passed between the expedition members without words. As the facility's alarm systems began broadcasting the commencement of Operation Lazarus, Evangeline looked around at her companions and saw her own determination reflected in their faces. They could not be party to a conspiracy that had deliberately caused the deaths of billions, regardless of the potential consequences for their own survival. "We stopped this," she announced quietly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Whatever the cost, we cannot allow this to continue." Cordelia Blackthorne had provided them with detailed information about the facility's critical systems, including the location of the Central Command Center where Operation Lazarus was being coordinated. The plan that emerged from their hurried discussions was desperate and dangerous, requiring them to split into small teams and move through the facility while avoiding the heavily armed security forces that were now on high alert. Thaddeus would lead Zephyr and Serafina to the communications center to broadcast a warning to survivor communities across the continent, while Evangeline and Dr. Lysander attempted to reach the biological weapons storage area to prevent their deployment. Cassius Nightingale volunteered for perhaps the most dangerous mission of all, infiltrating the Central Command Center to access the Coalition's computer systems and gather evidence of their conspiracy that could be transmitted along with the warning. His scientific background had given him familiarity with the facility's research networks, but the command center would be heavily defended and any attempt to access classified information would trigger immediate security responses. "If we're going to expose the truth about the plague's origins, we need proof that can't be dismissed or explained away," he told the group as they prepared to separate. The data in those systems could be the key to preventing this from happening again. The facility's corridors had taken on an ominous atmosphere as personnel rushed to their assigned positions for the operation's launch. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, while the constant stream of status updates over the intercom system created a sense of urgency that made every footstep seem dangerously loud. Zephyr found herself thinking about her brother Orion as she followed Thaddeus through the maze of passages, wondering if she would ever see him again and whether the choice they were making would ultimately help or harm the children they were trying to protect. The communications center was located in a heavily shielded section of the facility, its equipment designed to maintain contact with coalition forces across the continent during the coordinated strikes against infected population centers. Thaddeus used his lockpicking skills to bypass the security systems while Serafina kept watch for approaching guards. The sight of the sophisticated radio equipment filled Zephyr with both hope and despair. Hope that they might be able to warn other communities about the coalition's true nature, and despair at the realization of how vast and well-organized the conspiracy truly was. Meanwhile, Evangeline and Dr. Lysander had reached the biological weapons storage facility, where they discovered preparations for the deployment of enough weaponized agents to affect the entire continental landmass. The scale of the operation was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications, representing not just an attack on the infected but a fundamental transformation of the planet's ecosystem. Even if we stop the deployment, the environmental damage from what they've already released could take decades to reverse, Dr. Lysander observed grimly as he examined the storage containers. They're not just trying to eliminate the infected, they're reshaping the world to suit their vision of the future. Cassius had managed to reach the Central Command Center, where he discovered that Operation Lazarus was already underway in several locations across the continent. The biological weapons had been deployed against major infected population centers, and early reports suggested that the agents were working exactly as designed. However, his access to the Coalition's classified databases revealed information that was even more disturbing than Cordelia had suggested. The plague had not been the first attempt at population control. It was merely the latest in a series of engineered crises designed to consolidate power in the hands of a small elite group that viewed themselves as humanity's rightful rulers. As Zephyr began broadcasting their warning to survivor communities, she realized that they might already be too late to prevent the immediate effects of Operation Lazarus. The biological weapons were already spreading through infected populations, and within hours the creatures that had terrorized humanity for 3 years would begin to decompose en masse. However, the long-term consequences of the Coalition's actions would extend far beyond the elimination of the infected, creating a world where freedom and self-determination would be replaced by the absolute control of those who claimed to be humanity's saviors. The facility's security forces had finally located the expedition members, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors as armed guards moved to apprehend them. Thaddeus made the difficult decision to stay behind and hold off their pursuers while Zephyr and Serafina escaped with the evidence they had gathered. His sacrifice allowed them to reach an emergency exit that Cordelia had identified, but the cost of their mission was becoming clear as they realized that not all of them would survive to see the consequences of their actions. As they emerged from the facility into the cold mountain air, Zephyr could see smoke rising from distant valleys where the biological weapons had already begun their work. The infected hordes that had terrorized the continent for 3 years were dying, their decomposing bodies creating a landscape of death that stretched to the horizon. Yet even as humanity's greatest threat was being eliminated, she understood that they had traded one form of tyranny for another, exchanging the mindless hunger of the infected for the calculated control of those who claimed to be their liberators. The radio in her pack crackled with responses from survivor communities across the continent, voices filled with confusion and fear as they tried to understand the implications of the warning she had broadcast. Some communities reported that the infected in their areas were already showing signs of the accelerated decomposition, while others spoke of strange aircraft overhead and the appearance of coalition forces claiming to be there to help with the transition to a new world order. The future that was emerging from the ashes of the plague would be very different from anything the survivors had imagined, shaped by forces that had been manipulating events from the very beginning. As Zephyr looked back at the facility one last time before beginning the long journey home to Haven's Rest, she thought about her brother Orion and the world he would inherit. The infected were dying, but the price of that victory was the loss of humanity's innocence and the beginning of a new kind of struggle for freedom and dignity. The war between the living and the dead was ending, but the war for the soul of human civilization was just beginning. In her pack, she carried not just the evidence of the Coalition's conspiracy, but the responsibility to ensure that future generations would know the truth about the choices that had been made in humanity's darkest hour. The sun was setting behind the mountains as she walked away from Sanctuary Base, its dying light casting long shadows across a world that would never be the same. The dead were finally at rest, but the living would have to find new ways to survive in a world where the greatest threats came not from mindless monsters, but from those who claimed to be their saviors.